Part 18 of Volume 1 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 1 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, translated by Bernadotte Perrin. Pulicola, Part 1. Such was Solon, and with him we compare Pulicola, to whom the Roman people gave this surname later as a mark of honor. Before that he was called Publius Valerius, and was reputed to be a descendant of that ancient Valerius who was most instrumental in making the Romans and the Sabines one people instead of enemies. For it was he, more than any one else, that persuaded their kings to come together and settle their differences. Such being his lineage, Valerius, as we are told, while Rome was still a kingdom, was conspicuous for his eloquence and wealth, always employing the one with integrity and boldness in the service of justice, while with the other he gave liberal and kindly aid to the poor and needy. It was therefore clear that, should Rome become a democracy, he would at once be one of its foremost men. Now Tarquinius Superbus had not acquired his power honorably, but by the violation of divine and human laws. Nor did he exercise it in kingly fashion, but after the manner of an insolent and haughty tyrant. The people therefore hated him, resented his oppressions, and found occasion for revolt in the fate of Lucretia, who made away with herself after violence had been done to her. Lucius Brutus, engaging in the revolution, came to Valerius first of all, and with his most zealous assistance drove out the kings. Then, as long as the people were likely to elect one man as their commander in place of the king, Valerius acquiesced, thinking it more fitting that Brutus should have the office, because he had led the way to freedom. But the very name of monarchy was odious to the people, who thought it would be less vexatious to submit to an authority which was divided, and therefore proposed and demanded that two men should be elected to the highest office. Then Valerius, who hoped that he would be chosen next to Brutus and would be consul with him, was disappointed. For, against the wishes of Brutus, Tarquinius Collatinus, the husband of Lucretia, was elected as his colleague, instead of Valerius. He was a man of no greater excellence than Valerius, but the influential citizens were afraid of the kings, who were still putting forth many efforts outside, and trying to appease resentment inside the city, and they therefore desired to have as their commander the most pronounced enemy of the royal family, believing that he would make no concessions to them. Valerius, accordingly, vexed that his desire to do his utmost for his country should be doubted, merely because he had received no private injury at the hands of the tyrants, withdrew from the Senate, gave up his practice as an advocate, and abandoned entirely his public activities. This caused anxious remark among the multitude. They feared lest, in his wrath, he should attach himself to the royal exiles, and subvert the established order of the city, which was in a dangerous pass. But when Brutus, who had his suspicions of certain others also, desired the senators to take a sacrificial oath, and set a day for the ceremony, Valerius went down with a glad countenance into the forum, and was the first to take oath that he would make no submission or concession to the Tarquins, but would fight with all his might in defense of freedom. This pleased the Senate and inspired the consuls with courage, and his actions speedily confirmed his oath. For envoys came from Tarquin, bringing letters calculated to seduce the people, and specious words by which they thought the multitude were most likely to be corrupted, coming as they did from a king who seemed to have humbled himself, and to ask only moderate terms. These envoys the consuls thought should be brought before the assembled people, but Valerius would not suffer it. He was unalterably opposed to giving poor men, who considered a war a greater burden than tyranny, occasions and excuses for revolution. After this, other envoys came, announcing that Tarquin abdicated his throne, and ceased to wage war upon the city, but demanded for himself, his friends, and his kinsmen their moneys and effects, wherewith to maintain themselves in exile. Many were inclined to grant this favor, and Collatinus in particular joined in advocating it. But Brutus, a man of harsh and unyielding temper, ran forth into the forum and denounced his colleague as a traitor, because he would bestow the means for waging a war and maintaining tyranny on men to whom it were a terrible mistake to vote even a bare subsistence in exile. And when an assembly of the citizens was held, the first to speak among them was Gaius Menicius, a private man, who exhorted Brutus, and advised the Romans to see to it that the treasures fought with them against the tyrants, rather than with the tyrants against them. However, the Romans decided that, since they had the liberty for which they were at war, they would not sacrifice peace for the sake of wealth, but cast this also out along with the tyrants. Now the wealth, of course, was of very slight consequence to Tarquin, but the demand for it was at once a test of the people's disposition and a means of instigating treachery among them. And it was with this that the envoys busied themselves, making the property merely a pretext for remaining in the city, and saying that they were selling part of it, and reserving part, and sending part of it away. At last they succeeded in corrupting two of the noble families of Rome, that of the Achillii, which had 3 senators, and that of the Vitellii, which had 2. All these, by the mother's side, were nephews of Collatinus the consul, and besides, the Vitellii were related in another manner to Brutus. For Brutus had married a sister of theirs, and she had borne him several sons. 2 of these, who had come to manhood and were near kindred and close companions, the Vitellii won over and persuaded to join the plot for betraying the city, and to ally themselves with the great family and the royal expectations of the Tarquins, and rid themselves of the stupidity and cruelty of their father. For they gave the name of cruelty to that father's inexorable treatment of criminals. And as for his stupidity, he had for a long time, as it appears, feigned and assumed this, to ensure his safety among the cruel designs of the tyrants, and afterwards the surname of Brutus, which had been given him for it, clung to him. When, accordingly, the youths had been persuaded and held conference with the Aquilii, it was decided that all the conspirators should swear a great and dreadful oath, pouring in libation the blood of a slain man, and touching his entrails. For this purpose they met in the house of the Aquilii. Now the room in which the ceremony was to be held was, as was natural, dark and somewhat desolate. Without their knowing it, therefore, a slave named Vindicius had concealed himself therein, not with design or with any inkling of what was to happen there. He merely chanced to be there, and when they came in with anxious haste, he was afraid to be seen by them, and hid himself behind a chest that lay there, so that he saw what they did and heard what they resolved upon. Their decision was to kill the consuls, and when they had written letters to Tarquin to this effect, they gave them to his envoys, who were living there as guests at the Aquilii, and were then present at the conspiracy. Their business transacted, the conspirators departed, and then Vindicius stole secretly away from the house. He knew not what use to make of what had befallen him, but was at a loss, considering it a dreadful thing, as it really was, to arraign the sons of Brutus before their father, or the nephews of Collatinus before their uncle, on the most abominable charges, and yet believing that no Roman in an important station should be entrusted with important secrets. The last thing he could do, however, was to hold his peace, and was driven on by his knowledge of the affair. He made his way somehow to Valerius, attracted especially by the affable and kindly ways of the man, for he was easily accessible to all the needy, always kept open house, and never refused to hear or help one of the lowly. Accordingly, when Vindicius came to him and told him the whole story, in the presence of his brother Marcus only, and of his wife, Valerius was struck with consternation and fear, and would not let the man go, but shut him up in a room and sent his own wife to guard the door. Then he ordered his brother to surround the royal residence, seize the letters if possible, and to take the servants into custody. He himself, with the numerous clients and friends who were always about him, and with a large company of retainers, went to the house of the Aquilii, who were not at home. Therefore, to the surprise of everybody, he forced the door, and came upon the letters lying in the quarters where the envoys were lodged. Meantime the Aquilii came up in hot haste, joined battle at the door, and sought to take away the letters. But Valerius and his party resisted the attack, threw their togas about their opponents' necks, and after much struggling on both sides, at last succeeded in pushing them through the streets into the forum. The same success was had at the royal residence, where Marcus laid his hands on other letters which were to be conveyed away in the baggage, seized as many of the king's people as he could, and haled them to the forum. When the consuls had quieted the tumult, Valerius ordered Vindicius to be brought from his house. The denunciation was made, the letters were read aloud, and the accused had no courage to reply. Most of the people held their peace for very sorrow, but a few spoke of exile as a penalty, wishing to do Brutus a kindness. They were also somewhat encouraged to hope by the tears of Collatinus and the silence of Valerius. But Brutus, calling each of his sons by name, said, "Come, Titus, come, Tiberius, why do ye not defend yourselves against the denunciation?" But when they made no answer, though he put the question to them thrice, he turned to the lictors and said, "It is yours now to do the rest." These straightway seized the young men, tore off their togas, bound their hands behind their backs, and scourged their bodies with their rods. The rest could not endure to look upon the sight, but it is said that the father neither turned his gaze away, nor allowed any pity to soften the stern wrath that sat upon his countenance, but watched the dreadful punishment of his sons until the lictors threw them on the ground and cut off their heads with the axe. Then he rose and went away, after committing the other culprits to the judgment of his colleague. He had done a deed which it is difficult for one either to praise or blame sufficiently. For either the loftiness of his virtue made his spirit incapable of suffering, or else the magnitude of his suffering made it insensible to pain. In neither case was his act a trivial one, or natural to a man, but either godlike or brutish. However, it is right that our verdict should accord with the reputation of the man, rather than that his virtue should be discredited through weakness in the judge. For the Romans think that the work of Romulus in building the city was not so great as that of Brutus in founding and establishing its form of government. After Brutus had left the forum, at this time, after a long consternation, horror and silence prevailed among all who remained, as they thought of what had been done. But soon the weakness and hesitation of Collatinus gave the Aquilii fresh courage. They demanded time in which to make their defense, and the surrender of Vindicius to them, since he was their slave and ought not to be in the hands of their accusers. Collatinus was willing to grant this request, and was about to dissolve the assembly with this understanding, but Valerius was neither able to surrender the slave, who had mingled with the throng about him, nor would he suffer the people to release the traitors and withdraw. So at last he seized the persons of the Aquilii, and, summoning Brutus to the scene, crying aloud that Collatinus was acting shamefully in laying upon his colleague the necessity of killing his own sons, and then thinking it necessary for himself to bestow upon their wives the lives of his country's betrayers and foes. The consul was indignant at this, and ordered that Vindicius should be taken away, whereupon the lictors pushed their way through the crowd, seized the man, and beat those who tried to rescue him. Then Valerius and his friends stood forth in the man's defense, while the people shouted for Brutus to come. He turned back, therefore, and came, and when silence had been made for him, said that for his sons he himself sufficed as judge, and he would leave the fate of the other traitors to the votes of the citizens, who were free, and anyone who wished might speak and try to persuade the people. However, by this time there was no need of oratory, but a vote was taken which unanimously condemned the men, and they were beheaded. Collatinus, as it would seem, was already under some suspicion on account of his relationship to the royal family, and the second of his names was also hateful to the people, who loathed the sound of Tarquin. But after these recent events he saw that he was altogether obnoxious, and therefore resigned his office and withdrew secretly from the city. A new election was consequently held, and Valerius was triumphantly declared consul, thus receiving a worthy reward for his zeal. In this reward he thought that Vindicius ought to share, and therefore had a decree passed which made him, first of all, a freedman, a citizen of Rome, and entitled him to vote with any curia in which he chose to be enrolled. Other freedmen received the right of suffrage in much later times from Appius, who thus courted popularity. And from this Vindicius, as they say, a perfect manumission is to this day called vindicta. After this, the property of the royal family was given to the Romans to plunder, and their house and palace was razed to the ground; but the pleasantest part of the Field of Mars, which had belonged to Tarquin, was dedicated to that god. Now it chanced that it had just been reaped, and the grain still lying upon the ground; but since the field had been consecrated, they thought it not right to thresh it or use it in any way. They therefore with one accord carried the sheaves to the river and cast them in. In like manner they also cast in the trees which had been cut, and left the place wholly untilled and barren for the god of war. The quantities of stuff thus heaped together were not borne along by the current very far, but the advanced portions stopped and accumulated at the shallows which they encountered. The portions that followed these could not get through them, but impinged upon them and blended inexorably with them, and the aggregation was made increasingly firm and fast by the action of the stream. For this brought great quantities of mud, and the addition of which increased the size and cohesion of the mass. And besides, the impacts of the current were not rude, but with a gentle pressure pushed and molded everything together. Owing to its size and position, the mass acquired fresh size, and an extent sufficient to receive most of which was brought down by the river. It is now a sacred island over against the city, containing temples of the gods and covered walks, and is called in the Latin tongue Inter duos pontes. Some, however, say that this did not happen when the field of Tarquin was consecrated, but in later times when Tarquinia devoted another field adjacent to this. Now Tarquinia was a holy virgin, one of the Vestals, and received great honors for this act, among which was this, that of all women her testimony alone should be received. The people also voted her permission to marry, but she did not avail herself of it. This is how the thing appeared as the tale tells. But Tarquin, despairing of attempts to regain his throne by treachery, was eagerly welcomed by the Tuscans, who set out to restore him with a great force. The consuls led the Romans out to meet them, and arrayed their forces in certain sacred precincts, one of which was called the Arsian Grove, the other the Isuvian Meadow. When the engagement began, Aruns, son of Tarquin, and Brutus, the Roman consul, encountered each other. It was not by chance, but both were driven on by hatred and wrath, the one to attack a tyrant and foe of his country, the other to avenge himself on the author of his exile. They urged their horses to the combat, but since they engaged with fury rather than calculation, they were reckless of themselves, and fell by one another's hands. The battle, which had such a dreadful beginning, ended no less disastrously. The armies, after inflicting and suffering equal losses, were separated by a tempest. Valerius was therefore in perplexity, not knowing what the issue of the battle was, but seeing his soldiers as much disheartened by their own losses as they were encouraged by those of their enemies. So indistinguishable and equal was the slaughter on both sides. Each army, however, was more convinced of defeat by the near sight of its own dead than it could be of victory by conjecturing those of the enemy. When such a night came on as must needs follow such a battle, and both camps were quiet, they say that the grove was shaken, and a loud voice issued from it declaring the Tuscans had lost one man more in the battle than the Romans. The utterance was manifestly from some god, for at once the Romans were inspired by it to loud shouts of courage, while the Tuscans were panic-stricken and abandoned their camp in confusion, and were for the most part dispersed. As for those that remained, a little less than 5,000 in numbers, the Romans fell upon them, and took them prisoners, and plundered the camp. And when the dead on both sides were numbered, those of the enemy were found to be 11,300, and those of the Romans as many, less one. It is said that this battle was fought on the last day of February. Valerius celebrated a triumph for it, being the first consul to drive into the city on a 4-horse chariot, and the proceeding afforded a spectacle which was imposing and magnificent, not odious and offensive to the spectators, as some say, otherwise it would not have been continued with such ardor and emulation for countless years. The people were also pleased with the honors which Valerius bestowed upon his colleague at the funeral ceremonies. He even delivered a funeral oration in his honor, which was so admired by the Romans and won such favor that from that time on, when their great and good men died, encomiums were pronounced upon them by the most distinguished citizens. And this funeral oration of his is said to have been earlier than any among the Greeks, unless Anaximenes the orator is right in saying that the custom originated with Solon. But that which the rather displeased and offended the people of Valerius was this: Brutus, whom they regarded as the father of their liberties, would not consent to rule alone, but once and again chose a colleague to rule with him. But this Valerius, they said, in concentrating all power upon himself, is not a successor to the consulate of Brutus, to which he has no right, but to the tyranny of Tarquin. Yet why should he extol Brutus in words, while in deeds he imitates Tarquin, descending to the forum alone, escorted by all the rods and axes together, from a house no less stately than the royal house which he demolished? For as a matter of fact Valerius was living in a very splendid house on the so-called Velia. It hung high over the forum, commanded a view of all that passed there, and was surrounded by steeps and hard to get at, so that when he came down from it the spectacle was a lofty one, and the pomp of his procession worthy of a king. Accordingly Valerius showed what a good thing it is for men in power and high station to have ears which are open to frankness and truth instead of flattery. For when he heard it from his friends, who spared him no detail, that he was thought by the multitude to be transgressing, he was not obstinate or exasperated, but quickly got together a large force of workmen, and while it was still night tore the house down, and razed it all to the ground. In the morning, therefore, the Romans saw what had happened, and came flocking together. They were moved to love and admiration for the man's magnanimity, but were distressed for the house, and mourned for its stately beauty, as if it had been human, now that envy had unjustly compassed its destruction. They were also distressed for their ruler, who, like a homeless man, was now sharing the homes of others. For Valerius was received into the house of his friends, until the people gave him a site, and built him a house, of more modest dimensions than the one he had lived in before, where now stands the temple of Vicopota so called. Wishing now to make not only himself, but also the government, instead of formidable, submissive, and agreeable to the multitude, he removed the axes from the lictors' rods, and when he came into the assembly, inclined and lowered the rods themselves to the people, emphasizing the majesty of the democracy. This custom the consuls observe to this day, and before the multitude were aware of it, he had succeeded, not by humbling himself, as they thought, but by checking and removing their envious feelings through such moderation on his part, in adding to his real influence over them just as much as he seemed to take away from his authority, and the people submitted to him with pleasure and bore his yoke willingly. They therefore called him Pulicola, a name which signifies people cherisher. This name prevailed over the older names which he had borne, and it is the name which I shall use for him in the remainder of this life. For he permitted any who wished to enter the lists and sue for the consulship, but before the installation of his colleague, not knowing who he would be, but fearing an opposition due to some jealousy or ignorance, he used his sole authority for the enactment of his best and most important measures. In the first place, he filled up the Senate, which was much reduced in numbers, for some had long before been put to death by Tarquin, and others had recently fallen in the battle with the Tuscans. Those who were enrolled in this body by him amounted, they say, to 164. After this he enacted several laws, one of which especially strengthened the position of the commons, by allowing a defendant to appeal to the people from the judgment of the consuls. A second made it a capital offense to assume a magistracy which the people had not bestowed. A third, following these, came to the relief of the poor. It lifted the taxes from the citizens, so that all engaged more zealously in manufactures and commerce. And the one which was enacted against disobedience to the consuls was thought to be no less popular in its character, and to be in the interest of the many rather than of the powerful. For the fine which it imposed on disobedience was only the worth of 5 oxen and 2 sheep. Now the value of sheep was 10 obols, and that of an ox 100, for the Romans at that time did not use much coined money, but their wealth consisted in flocks and herds. Therefore to this day they call their substance peculium, from pecus, cattle, and their oldest coins are stamped with the figure of an ox, a sheep, or a hog, and they actually gave their own sons such surnames as Suilius, Bubocus, Caparius and Porcius, the last two from capra and porcus, their words for goat and pig. End of Pulicola, Volume 1. Part 19 of Volume 1 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 1 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, translated by Bernadotte Perrin. Pulicola, Part 2. But although in these particulars he showed himself a popular and moderate lawgiver, in the case of an immoderate offense he made the penalty severe. For he enacted a law by which any one who sought to make himself tyrant might be slain without trial, and the slayer should be free from blood guiltiness if he produced proofs of the crime. For although it is impossible for one who attempts so great a task to escape all notice, it is not impossible for him to do so long enough to make himself too powerful to be brought to trial, which trial his very crime precludes. He therefore gave any one who was able to do so the privilege of anticipating the culprit's trial. He also received praise for his law concerning the public treasury. When it was necessary for the citizens to contribute from their substance means for carrying on the war, he was unwilling to assume the administration of it himself, or to allow his friends to do so, or, indeed, to have the public moneys brought into any private house. He therefore made the temple of Saturn a treasury, as it is to this day, and gave the people the privilege of appointing 2 young men as quaestors or treasurers. The first to be thus appointed was Publius Veturius and Marcus Minucius, and large sums of money were collected. For 130,000 names were on the assessment lists, orphans and widows being excused from the contribution. This matter regulated, he caused Lucretius, the father of Lucretia, to be appointed his colleague in the consulship. To him he yielded the precedence, as the elder man, and committed to him the so-called fasces, a privilege of seniority which has continued from that day to this. But Lucretius died a few days afterwards, and in a new election Marcus Horatius was chosen consul, and shared the office with Pulicola for the remainder of the year. While Tarquin was stirring up in Tuscany another war against the Romans, a thing of great portent is said to have happened. When Tarquin was still king, and had all but completed the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, either in consequence of an oracle, or else of his own good pleasure, he commissioned certain Tuscan craftsmen of Veii to place upon its roof a chariot of terra cotta. Soon after this he was driven from his throne. The Tuscans, however, modelled the chariot and put it in a furnace for firing, but the clay did not contract and shrink in the fire as it usually does when its moisture evaporates. Instead of this it expanded and swelled and took on such size, strength, and hardness that it could with difficulty be removed, even after the roof of the furnace had been taken off and its sides torn away. To the seers, accordingly, this seemed a divine portent of prosperity and power for those who should possess the chariot, and encouraged and incited Horatius to claim the privilege of consecrating the temple. At a time, then, when Pulicola was necessarily absent on military service, they got a vote passed that Horatius should perform the consecration, and conducted him up to the Capitol, feeling that they could not have gained their point had Pulicola been in the city. Some, however, say that Pulicola was designated by lot, against his inclination, for the expedition, and Horatius for the consecration. It is possible to infer how the matter stood between them from what happened at the consecration. It was the Ides of September, a day which nearly coincides with the full moon of the Attic month Metageitnion. The people were all assembled on the Capitol. Silence had been proclaimed, and Horatius, after performing the other ceremonies, and laying hold upon the door of the temple, as custom is, was pronouncing the usual words of consecration. Just then Marcus, the brother of Pulicola, who had long been standing by the door and was watching his opportunity, said, "O consul, thy son lies dead of sickness in the camp." This distressed all who heard it, but Horatius, not at all disturbed, merely said, "Cast forth the dead then, whither ye please, for I take no mourning upon me," and finished his consecration. Now the announcement was not true, but Marcus thought by his falsehood to deter Horatius from his duty. Wonderful therefore was the firm poise of the man, whether he at once saw through the deceit, or believed the story without letting it overcome him. A similar fortune seems to have attended the dedication of the second temple. The first, as I have said, was built by Tarquin, but consecrated by Horatius. This was destroyed by fire during the civil wars. The second temple was built by Sulla, but Catulus was commissioned to consecrate it, after the death of Sulla. This temple too was destroyed during the troublous times of Vitellius, and Vespasian began and completed the third, with the good fortune that attended him in all his undertakings. He lived to see it completed, and did not live to see it destroyed, as it was soon after, and in dying before his work was destroyed, he was just so much more fortunate than Sulla, who died before his was consecrated. For upon the death of Vespasian, the Capitol was burned. The fourth temple, which is now standing on the same site as the others, was both completed and consecrated by Domitian. It is said that Tarquin expended upon its foundations 40,000 pounds of silver. But the greatest wealth now attributed to any private citizen of Rome would not pay the cost of gilding alone of the present temple, which was more than 12,000 talents. Its pillars are of Pentelic marble, and their thickness was once most happily proportioned to their length, for we saw them at Athens. But when they were recut and scraped at Rome, they did not gain as much in polish as they lost in symmetry and beauty, and they now look too slender and thin. However, if anyone who is amazed at the costliness of the Capitol had seen but a single colonnade in the palace of Domitian, or a basilica, or a bath, or the apartments for his concubines, then, as Epicharmus says to the spendthrift, "'Tis not beneficent thou art diseased, thy mania is to give." So he would have been moved to say to Domitian, "'Tis not pious, nor nobly ambitious, thou art diseased, thy mania is to build, like the famous Midas, thou desirest that everything become gold and stone to thy touch." So much then on this head. But to return to Tarquin, after the great battle in which he lost his son in a duel with Brutus, he fled for refuge to Clusium, and became a suppliant to Lars Porsena, the most powerful king in Italy, who was thought also to be a man of worth and noble ambitions. He promised Tarquin his aid and assistance. So, in the first place, he sent to Rome and ordered them to receive Tarquin as their king. Then, when the Romans refused, he declared war upon them, proclaimed the time and place of his attack, and marched thither with a great force. Pulicola was chosen consul for the second time in his absence, and Titus Lucretius as his colleague. Returning therefore to Rome, and wishing in the first place to surpass Porsena in the loftiness of his spirit, he built the city of Sigliuria, although his adversary was already near at hand. After he had fortified it at great expense, he sent to it a colony of 700 men, indicating that he had no concern or fear about the war. However, a sharp assault was made upon its wall by Porsena, and its garrison was driven out. They fled to Rome, where the pursuing enemy almost followed them into the city. But Pulicola promptly sallied out to their aid in front of the gate, joined battle by the riverside with the enemy, who pressed on in great numbers, and held out against them until he was desperately wounded and carried bodily out of the battle. The same fate overtook Lucretius, his colleague also, so that dismay fell upon the Romans, and they fled for safety towards the city. But as the enemy was forcing their way under the wooden bridge, Rome was in danger of being taken by storm. Horatius Cocles, however, first, and with him two of the most illustrious men of the city, Herminius and Lartius, defended the wooden bridge against them. Horatius had been given his surname of Cocles because he had lost one of his eyes in the wars. Some, however, say that his nose was flat and sunken, so that there was nothing to separate his eyes, and his eyebrows ran together, and that for this reason the multitude wished to call him Cyclops, but by a slip of the tongue the name of Cocles was generally prevalent instead. This Cocles, standing at the head of the bridge, kept the enemy back until his companions had cut the bridge in two behind him. Then, all accoutred as he was, he plunged into the river and swam across to the other side, in spite of a wound in the buttocks from a Tuscan spear. Pulicola, out of admiration for his valor, proposed that every Roman should at once contribute for him as much provisions as it could be consumed in a day, and that afterwards he should be given as much land as he could plow round in a day. Besides this, they set up a bronze statue of him in the temple of Vulcan, to console him with the honor for the lameness consequent upon his wound. While Parsenna was closely investing the city, a famine afflicted the Romans, and another Tuscan army on its own account invaded their territory. Pulicola, who was now consul for the third time, thought that Parsenna must be met by a quiet and watchful resistance within the city, but he sallied out upon the other Tuscan army, engaged it, routed it, and slew 5,000 of them. The story of Mucius has been often and variously told, but I must give it as it seems most credible to me. He was a man well endowed with every virtue, but most excellent in war. Designing to kill Porsenna, he stole into his camp, wearing a Tuscan habit and using the speech to correspond. After walking around the tribunal where the king was sitting with others, not knowing him certainly, and fearing to inquire about him, he drew his sword and slew that one of the group that he thought most likely to be the king. Upon this he was seized, and was being questioned, when a sort of pan containing live coals was brought to Porsenna, who was about to offer sacrifice. Mucius held his right hand over the flames, and while the flesh was burning, stood looking at Porsenna with a bold and steadfast countenance, until the king was overcome with admiration and released him, and handed him back his sword, reaching it down to him from the tribunal. Mucius stretched out his left hand and took it, on account of which, they say, he received the surname of Scaevola, which means left-handed. Then he said that, although he had conquered the fear which Porsenna inspired, he was vanquished by the nobility which he displayed, and would reveal out of gratitude what he would not have disclosed under compulsion. 300 Romans, then, said he, with the same resolution as mine, are now prowling about in thy camp and watching their opportunity. I was chosen by lot to make the first attempt upon thee, and I am not distressed at what has happened. So noble is the man whom I failed to kill, and so worthy to be a friend rather than an enemy of the Romans. On hearing this, Porsenna believed it to be true, and felt more inclined to come to terms, not so much, I suppose, through fear of the 300, as of wondering admiration for the lofty spirit and bravery of the Romans. All other writers agree in giving this Mucius the surname of Scaevola, but Athenodorus, the son of Sandon, in his book addressed to Octavia, the sister of Augustus Caesar, says that his surname was posthumous. Pulicola himself, moreover, thinking that Porsenna would be more valuable as a friend and ally of the city than he was dangerous as an enemy, did not shrink from making the king an arbiter in his dispute with Tarquin, but often boldly challenged Tarquin to do so, confident in proving that he was the basest of men, and justly deprived of his kingdom. And when Tarquin gave him a rough answer, saying that he would make no man his judge, least of all Porsenna, seeing that he was swerving from his alliance with him, Porsenna was displeased and perceived the weakness of his cause. His son Aruns also pleaded earnestly with him in behalf of the Romans. Consequently, he put an end to his war against them, on condition that they give up the territory of Tuscany which they had taken, sent back their prisoners of war, and received back their deserters. In confirmation of these conditions, the Romans gave as hostages 10 young men from their noblest families, and as many maidens, of whom Valeria, the daughter of Pulicola, was one. After these stipulations had been carried out, and when Porsenna had already remitted all his warlike preparations through his confidence in the treaty, these Roman maidens went down to the river to bathe, at a place where the curving bank formed a bay and kept the water especially still and free from waves. As they saw no guard near, nor any one else passing or crossing the stream, they were seized with a desire to swim away, notwithstanding the depth and whirl of the strong current. And some say that one of them, named Cloelia, crossed the stream on horseback, exhorting them and encouraging the rest as they swam. But when they came in safety to Pulicola, he bestowed no admiration or affection upon them, but was distressed because he would be thought less true to his word than Porsenna, and because the daring exploit of the maidens would be called a base fraud on the part of the Romans. He seized them, therefore, and sent them back to Parsena. But Tarquin and his men got timely intelligence of this, set an ambush for the convoy of the maidens, and attacked them in superior numbers as they passed along. The party attacked defended themselves, nevertheless, and Valeria, the daughter of Pubicola, darted through the combatants and fled, with the help of 3 attendants who broke through the crowd with her, and made good her escape. The rest of the maidens were mingled with the combatants and in peril of their lives. But Aruns, the son of Porsenna, learning of the affair, came with all speed to their assistance, put their enemies to flight, and rescued the Romans. When Porsenna saw the maidens thus brought back, he asked for the one who had begun the enterprise and encouraged the rest of it. And when he heard Cloelia named as the one, he looked upon her with a gracious and beaming countenance, and ordering one of the royal horses to be brought, all fittingly caparisoned, he made her a present of it. Those who say that Cloelia, and Cloelia alone, crossed the river on horseback, produce this fact as evidence. Others dispute the inference, and say that the Tuscan merely honored in this way the maiden's courage. But an equestrian statue of her stands by the Via Sacra as you go to the Palatine. Some say that it represents not Cloelia, but Valeria. Porsenna, thus reconciled with the Romans, gave the city many proofs of his magnanimity. In particular, he ordered his Tuscan soldiers, when they evacuated their camp, to take with them their arms only, and nothing else, leaving it full of abundant provisions and all sorts of valuables which he turned over to the Romans. Therefore it is that, down to this very day, when there is a sale of public property, Porsenna's goods are cried first, and thus the man's kindness is honored with perpetual remembrance. Moreover, a bronze statue of him used to stand near the Senate house, of simple and archaic workmanship. After this, when the Sabines invaded the Roman territory, Marcus Valerius, a brother of Pubicola, was made consul, and with him Postumius Tubertus. Insomuch as the most important steps were taken with the advice and assistance of Pubicola, Marcus was victorious in 2 great battles, and in the second of them, without losing a single Roman, slew 13,000 of the enemy. Besides his triumphs, he also obtained the honor of a house built for him at the public charge on the Palatine. And whereas the doors of the other houses at the time opened inwards into the vestibule, they made the outer door of his house, and of his alone, to open outwards, in order that by this concession he might be constantly partaking of public honor. They say that all Greek doors used to open outwards in this way, and the conclusion is drawn from their comedies, where those who are about to go out of a house beat noisily on the inside of their own doors, in order that persons passing by or standing in front of them may hear, and not be taken by surprise when the doors open out into the street. In the following year Pubicola was consul again for the 4th time, when there was expectation of a war with the Sabines and Latins combined. At the same time also a sort of superstitious terror seized upon the city, because all the women who were pregnant were delivered of imperfect offspring, and all births were premature. Wherefore, by direction of the Sibylline books, Pubicola made propitiatory sacrifices to Pluto, and renewed certain games that had been recommended by Apollo. And after he thus made the city more cheerful in its hopes and expectations from the gods, he turned his attention to what it feared from men. For their enemies were plainly making great preparations and a powerful league against them. Now there was among the Sabines one Appius Clausus, a man whose wealth made him powerful, as his personal prowess made him illustrious, but who was most eminent for his lofty character and for his great eloquence. He could not, however, escape the fate of all great men, but was an object of jealous hate, and when he tried to stop the war, those who hated him charged him with trying to increase the power of Rome, with a view to making himself tyrant and master of his own country. Perceiving that the multitude gave a ready ear to these stories, and that he himself was obnoxious to the war party and the military, he feared the issue, but with a large and powerful coterie of friends and kinsmen to defend him, continued his opposition. This made the Sabines put off and delay the war. Pubicola, accordingly, making it his business not only to know about these matters, but also to foment and promote the faction, kept some of his followers employed in bringing to Clausus from him such messages as this: Pubicola thinks thee too worthy and just a man to inflict any evil upon thy fellow citizens in self-defense. even though thou art wronged by them. But if thou wishest, for thine own safety, to change thine allegiance and flee from those who hate thee, he will receive thee with public and private honours, which are worthy of thine own excellence and splendour of Rome." On repeated consideration of the matter, this course seemed to Clausus the best that was open to him. He therefore summoned his friends, who in like manner persuaded many more to join him, and taking 5,000 families from their homes, wives and children included, the most peaceful folk among the Sabines, of gentle and sedate lives, he led them to Rome. Pulicola knew beforehand of their coming, and gave them an eager and kindly welcome, admitting them to all rights and privileges, for he at once incorporated the families in the Roman state, and gave each 2 acres of land on the river Anio. To Clausus, however, he gave 25 acres of land, and enrolled him among the senators. This was the beginning of a political power which he used so wisely that he mounted to the highest dignity and acquired great influence. The Claudian family which is descended from him is no less illustrious than any in Rome. Though the schism among the Sabines was thus removed by the emigration of these men, their popular leaders would not suffer them to settle down into quiet, but complained bitterly that Clausus, by becoming an exile and an enemy, should bring to pass what he could not effect by his persuasions at home, namely, that Rome pay no penalty for her outrages. Setting out, therefore, with a large army, they encamped near Fidenae, and placed 2,000 men at arms in ambush just outside Rome in wooded hollows. Their intention was that a few of their horsemen, as soon as it was day, should boldly ravage the country; but these had been ordered, whenever they approached the city and were attacked, to retire gradually until they had drawn the enemy into the ambuscade. That very day Pulicola learned of this plan from deserters, and took measures accordingly, dividing up his forces. Postumius Balbus, his son-in-law, while it was not yet evening, went out with 3,000 men at arms, occupied the hills under which the Sabines were lying in ambush, and kept the enemy under observation. Lucretius, his colleague, retaining in the city the lightest armed and most impetuous troops, was ordered to attack the enemy's horsemen as they ravaged the country. He himself took the rest of the army, and encircled the enemy in their camp. Favored by a heavy fog, at the break of day Postumius, with loud shouts, fell upon the ambuscade from the heights, while Lucretius hurled his troops upon the horsemen as they rode down towards the city, and Pulicola attacked the camp of the enemy. At all posts then the Sabines were worsted and undone. Wherever they were, they made no defence, but fled, and the Romans straightway slew them. The very hopes that they placed in one another proved most fatal to them; for each party, supposing that the other was safe, had no thought of holding their ground and fighting, but those in the camp ran towards those in the ambuscade, while those on their part ran to those in the camp, so that fugitives encountered fugitives, and found those needing succor from whom they expected succor themselves. And all the Sabines would have perished, had not the neighbouring city of Fidenae afforded a refuge to some, especially to those who fled from the camp when it was captured. All who did not gain the city were either slain or brought back to Rome as prisoners. This success the Romans, although they were wont to attribute all such great events to the influence of the gods, considered to be the work of their general alone; and the first thing his soldiers were heard to say was that Pulicola had delivered their enemies into their hands, lame, blind, and all but imprisoned, to be dispatched by their swords. Great wealth also accrued to the people from the spoils and prisoners. But Pulicola, immediately after celebrating his triumph, and handing the city over to the consuls appointed to succeed him, died. So far as it can possibly be achieved by men who are regarded as honourable and good, he had brought his life to perfection. The people, as if they had done nothing to show their esteem for him while he was alive, but owed him every homage, decreed that his body should be buried at the public charge, and that every man should contribute a quadrans toward the honour. The women also, by private agreement amongst themselves, mourned a whole year for him, with a mourning which was honourable and enviable. He was buried, too, by express vote of the citizens, within the city, near the so-called Velia, and all his family were to have the privilege of burial there. Now, however, none of his family is actually buried there, but the body is carried thither and set down, and some one takes a burning torch and holds it under the bier for an instant, and then takes it away. attesting by this act that the deceased has the right of burial there, but relinquishes the honor. After this the body is borne away. End of Pulicola, Part 2. Part 20 of Volume 1 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Volume 1 of Plutarch's Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, translated by Bernadotte Perrin. Comparison of Solon and Pulicola. There is, then, something peculiar in this comparison, and something which has not been true of any other thus far, namely, that the second imitated the first, and the first bore witness for the second. For it must be plain that the verdict concerning happiness which Solon presented to Croesus is more applicable to Pulicola than to Tellus. Tellus, whom Solon pronounced the most blessed man he knew, because of his fortunate lot, his virtue, and his goodly offspring, was not celebrated in Solon's poems as a good man, nor did his children or any magistracy of his achieve a reputation, whereas Pulicola, while he lived, was foremost among the Romans in influence and repute for virtue, and since his death the most illustrious family lines of our own day, like the Pulicoli, the Messali, and the Valerii, have for 600 years ascribed the glory of their noble birth to him. Tellus, moreover, though he kept his post and fought like a brave man, died at the hands of his enemies, whereas Pulicola slew his enemies, which is a better fortune than to be slain by them, saw his country victorious through his efforts as consul and general, and enjoyed honors and triumphs before he came to the end which Solon pronounced so enviable and blessed. Still further, what Solon says to Mimnermus in arguing with him on the proper duration of human life: "May not an unlamented death be mine, but unto friends let me be cause when dead for sorrow and for sighing," argues Pulicola a happy man. For when he died, his loss filled not only his friends and kindred, but the entire city, numbering many tens of thousands, with weeping and yearning and sorrow. For the women of Rome mourned for him as though they had lost a son, or a brother, or a common father. "Wealth I desire to have," says Solon, "but wrongfully to get it I do not wish," believing that punishment would follow. And Pulicola's wealth was not only not ill got, but also nobly spent in benefactions to the needy. So that if Solon was the wisest, Pulicola was the most happy of men, since what Solon prayed for as the greatest and fairest of blessings, these Pulicola was privileged to win and continued to enjoy until the end. Thus did Solon enhance the fame of Pulicola, and Pulicola too in his political activities enhanced the fame of Solon, by making him the fairest of examples for one who is arranging a democracy. For he took away the arrogant powers of the consulship, and made it gracious and acceptable to all, and he adopted many of Solon's laws. For instance, he put the appointment of their rulers in the power of the people, and gave defendants the right of appealing to the people, as Solon to the jurors. He did not, indeed, create a new senate, as Solon did, but he increased the one already existing to almost double its numbers. And his appointment of quaestors over the public moneys had a like origin. Its purpose was that the consul, if a worthy officer, might not be without leisure for his more important duties, and if unworthy, might not have greater opportunities for injustice by having both the administration and the treasury in his hands. Hatred of tyranny was more intense in Pulicola than in Solon, for in case any one attempted to usurp the power, by Solon's law he could be punished only after conviction, whereas Pulicola made it lawful to kill him before any trial. Moreover, though Solon rightly and justly plumes himself on rejecting absolute power, even when circumstances offered it to him, and his fellow citizens were willing that he should take it, it redounds no less to the honor of Pulicola that, when he had received a tyrannical power, he made it more democratic, and did not use even the prerogatives which were his by right of possession. And of the wisdom of such a course Solon seems to have been conscious even before Pulicola, when he says that a people, then will yield the best obedience to its guides, when it is neither humored nor oppressed too much. Peculiar to Solon was his remission of debts, and by this means especially he confirmed the liberties of the citizens. For equality under the laws is of no avail, if the poor are robbed of it by their debts; nay, in the very places where they are supposed to exercise their liberties the most, there they are most in subjection to the rich, since in the courts of justice, the offices of state, and in public debates, they are under their orders and do them service. And what is of greater moment here, though sedition also follows an abolition of debts, in this case alone, by employing opportunely, as it were, a dangerous but powerful medicine, Solon actually put an end to the sedition which was already rife, for his own virtue and high repute prevailed over the over-repute and odium of the measure. As regards their political careers in general, Solon's was the most brilliant in the beginning, for he led the way and followed no man, and it was alone and without colleagues that he effected the most and greatest of his public measures. But in the ending the other was the more fortunate and enviable, for Solon lived to see with his own eyes the dissolution of his polity, while that of Pulicola preserved order in the city down to the civil wars. Solon, as soon as he had made the laws, left them inscribed on wooden tablets, and destitute of a defender, and departed from Athens; whereas Pulicola, by remaining in the city, serving as consul, and busying himself in public affairs, firmly and safely established his form of government. And further, though Solon knew beforehand of the designs of Pisistratus, he was not able to hinder them, but yielded to his tyranny in its incipiency; whereas Pulicola subverted and drove out a kingly power which was strong with the might which many ages bring. Thus, while exhibiting virtues equal to Solon's, and a purpose identical with his, he enjoyed a good fortune and an efficacious power which supplemented his virtues. When we consider their military careers, moreover, Diomachus of Plataea does not allow Solon even the conduct of the war against the Megarians, as we have described it; but Pulicola, fighting and commanding in person, brought the greatest struggles to a successful issue. And still further, comparing their political activities, Solon, in play, so to speak, and counterfeiting madness, went forth to plead for the recovery of Salamis; but Pulicola, without any subterfuges, ran the greatest risks, set himself in opposition to the party of the Tarquins, and detected their treachery. Then, after being mainly instrumental in the capture and punishment of the traitors, he not only drove out the tyrants themselves from the city, but extirpated their very hopes of return. And if he thus sturdily and resolutely confronted situations which call for active and spirited opposition, still better did he deal with those which required peaceable intercourse and gentle persuasion, as when he tactfully won over Porsena, an invincible and formidable foe, and made him a friend of Rome. But here perhaps some will say that Solon won back Salamis for the Athenians when they had given it up, whereas Pulicola relinquished territory which the Romans had acquired. But we must view men's actions in the light of the times which call them forth. The subtle statesman will handle each issue that arises in the most feasible manner, and often saves the whole by relinquishing a part, and by yielding small advantages secures greater ones. And so Pulicola, in that instance, by yielding the territory which belonged to others, saved all that was assuredly his own, and procured besides, for those that were hard put to it to save their city, the camp of their besiegers with all their stores. He made his adversary judge in the controversy, won his case, and received besides what his people would gladly have given for the victory. For Porsena put a stop to the war, and left the Romans all his provisions for carrying it on, owing to the confidence in their virtue and nobility with which their consul had inspired them. End of comparison of Solon with Pulicola. And end of Plutarch's Lives of the Ancient Greeks and Romans, Volume 1.